My husband spent nearly a year telling me that my best friend was like a sister, and because I loved them both, I let that sentence protect them longer than it should have. He used it every time something felt slightly off. If they laughed too easily together, she was like a sister. If she texted him about something that could have gone through me, she was like a sister. If I noticed that he defended her too quickly, or that she always seemed to know where he was before I did, I was overthinking it because, according to him, she was like a sister. What I did not understand then was that men like my husband do not always lie with complicated stories. Sometimes they lie with familiar language that sounds so harmless you feel embarrassed for even questioning it. And if I had not seen those hotel bookings with my own eyes, if I had not watched the dates line up like a confession too arrogant to hide properly, I might still be apologizing to two people who were betraying me in perfect sync. Before I tell you how I found out, tell me where you're watching from tonight. My best friend, Nina, had been in my life long before my husband, Daniel, ever was. That matters, because betrayal always lands differently when one of the traitors was trusted before the marriage even existed. Nina and I met in college and built the kind of friendship that survives bad apartments, low-paying jobs, heartbreaks, ugly haircuts, family drama, and all the weird humiliations of your 20s. She knew who I was before I learned how to edit myself for the world. She knew what made me insecure, what made me ambitious, what kind of love I used to say I wanted when we were still young enough to imagine that wanting something clearly was the same thing as getting it. She had seen me through my worst breakup, sat with me while I cried over things I was embarrassed to cry about, and celebrated every good thing that came afterward. Or at least I thought she had. When I met Daniel, Nina was one of the first people I introduced him to. I still think about that sometimes, not because it changes anything, but because betrayal always has some small ceremonial beginning that becomes unbearable in hindsight. The first dinner the three of us had together was easy and fun. Nina liked him immediately, which mattered to me because she had never been impressed by men just because they were charming. Daniel was funny in a way that didn't feel rehearsed, polished without being stiff, and warm in that effortless social way people often mistake for goodness. He remembered details. He asked Nina real questions instead of treating her like a side character in my life. At the time, that felt respectful. Later, much later, I would realize that some people do not earn trust separately. They earn it in clusters. That way, when one relationship starts to rot, the other one keeps gaslighting you on its behalf. Daniel and I got married after 2 years. Nina stood beside me at the wedding. She helped me zip up my dress, fix my hair, breathe through the panic of walking into a room full of people who would be studying every detail of my happiness. She cried during the vows. Daniel hugged her at the reception and joked that he was technically marrying into her too because she came with the package. Everyone laughed. Nina said he better take care of me or he'd have to answer to her. It was one of those lines women say at weddings all the time, the kind that sounds loving and protective and harmless. I think if someone had whispered in my ear that day that one day I would see my husband and that same friend move through the world with matching hotel reservations under fake excuses, I would have slapped them. The first 2 years of marriage were stable in the way real life often is when nothing is especially cinematic. We worked, cooked, hosted friends, argued about ordinary things, saved for bigger goals, and slowly moved into the routines that make a couple feel established. Nina remained close. She came over for dinner, dropped by on Sundays, texted me memes during work meetings, and became such a normal part of our marriage's landscape that eventually I stopped noticing how unusual that was. Daniel got along with her so well that at times I even felt grateful. Most women I knew had the opposite problem, some awkward tension between husband and best friend or polite distance that made everything slightly formal. My life looked easier than that. My husband liked my best friend. My best friend liked my husband. We were, I thought, the adult version of people who knew how to build a healthy circle. If there was one thing that should have warned me earlier, it was not some huge, obvious red flag. It was the frequency of the phrase itself, like a sister. Daniel said it too much. People who are telling the truth usually do not need to brand it so often. But because the phrase sounded virtuous, because it presented him as respectful and me as lucky, I never examined why he kept needing to reinforce it. At dinners, if someone joked that Nina was over too often, he would laugh and say, "She's like a sister." If I asked why she had texted him directly about restaurant reservations instead of messaging me, he'd say, "Come on, she's like a sister." If he picked up her call while I was in the shower and said she was asking about my birthday present, he would toss the phone onto the couch and grin at me like I was adorable for being curious. "Relax," he'd say. "She's like family. Family. Sister." Safe words. Men like Daniel understand the moral weight of certain words. They know which ones make women ashamed to question them. The shifts, when they began, were quiet enough to be dismissed one at a time. Nina started canceling on me more often, but remained available for group things involving Daniel. She was busy, fried, terrible at planning, but somehow she always seemed free when the invitation came through him. Daniel started going on more short work trips, nothing dramatic, one night here, 2 nights there, the kind of travel that sounds too boring to investigate. He worked in regional sales for a design supply company, which meant travel was not new. It was just more frequent. If I noticed that a trip seemed oddly timed right after Nina had mentioned being overwhelmed and needing a break, I would feel the thought forming and then crush it myself, because what kind of woman suspects two people she loves based on timing and vibes? An insecure woman. A paranoid one. A cliché. I had too much pride to become that kind of wife in my own mind. The really dangerous thing about betrayal between two trusted people is that each one helps sanitize the other. If Daniel was cold or distant, Nina could explain him. If Nina was flaky or unavailable, Daniel could excuse her. They didn't need a formal system. They just needed me emotionally trained to see both of them as fundamentally safe. There were times I would mention to Nina that Daniel seemed distracted lately, and she would tell me men go through phases, that work probably had him mentally fried, that I should not start assigning meaning to every silence. There were times I would tell Daniel that Nina seemed off, harder to reach, weirdly surface level lately, and he would tell me not to make her recent stress about myself. "She loves you," he would say. "She's just all over the place lately." I used to think I was lucky to have a husband who could be kind about my friendships and a best friend who supported my marriage. I did not understand I was being softened from two sides. The first specific incident that comes back to me now happened at a rooftop birthday dinner for one of Daniel's coworkers. Nina wasn't even supposed to be there. It was not her crowd, not her scene, and she had told me 2 days earlier that she was exhausted and would probably stay in. Then we arrived, and there she was, already at the bar in a black dress I had never seen, laughing with Daniel's hand lightly at her back like it had been there before I walked in. The touch disappeared almost instantly when they saw me, and if you had blinked, you might have missed it. I almost missed it myself. Daniel kissed my cheek and said, "Look who showed up after all," like he was pleasantly surprised. Nina hugged me and said she changed her mind at the last minute because staying home felt depressing. Nothing about that required accusation. Nothing about it was enough to force a crisis. But something in me tightened anyway. Later that night in the car, I asked Daniel whether he knew she was coming. He said no too quickly, then corrected himself and said she had texted him because she couldn't reach me. I looked at my phone. No missed call, no text from her. When I pointed that out, he shrugged and said maybe she sent it earlier and changed her mind. Then he smiled and added, "You're reading way too much into a birthday drink. She's like a sister." There it was again. A sentence placed gently over a bruise. A few weeks later, Nina invited me to lunch and spent almost half of it asking how things were between me and Daniel. Not in the normal checking-in way. In this oddly focused, almost investigative way. Was he stressed? Was he still traveling so much? Was he being affectionate? Were we okay? I answered honestly enough, saying nothing dramatic was wrong, but he had been harder to read lately. Nina reached across the table and squeezed my hand and told me every marriage has seasons, that men pull inward when work gets heavy, and that I should not create stories where none exist. It would have sounded supportive if it had not echoed Daniel so precisely. At the time, I just thought they happened to be saying the same thing. Later, I understood what it really was. A coordinated emotional weather report designed to make me distrust my own barometer. Around that time, I started noticing how often Nina's name came up in our house when she wasn't there. Daniel would mention something she said, some article she forwarded, some random opinion she had about a restaurant or a hotel or a neighborhood. Once he referenced a joke she had made earlier that week, and when I said, "When did you two even talk about that?" He answered so naturally that I almost felt stupid for asking. He said she had called while I was in the shower. There was always a reason. There was always a casual explanation. A man does not need one airtight lie when 10 small, believable ones will keep you tired and embarrassed. The hotel bookings entered my life through a complete accident, which is something I still find almost offensive in its simplicity. I was not snooping. I was not secretly checking his accounts or stalking Nina's inbox. If I had been, maybe I would have found out sooner and spared myself months of humiliation. But I was. I was booking a work conference. My company had approved travel for a 3-day industry event, and because Daniel handled most of our credit card reward points, I texted him asking if I should use the shared travel account login or just pay and expense it later. He replied that I should use the account because there were enough points to offset at least one night. He was driving, so he sent me the login credentials in a rush. They worked. I booked my room. Then, because the site kept a history tab, I saw several recent reservations. At first, I almost clicked away. It felt private, and even though we were married, I was not in the habit of combing through his bookings. Then I noticed one reservation wasn't work-related at all. It was a boutique hotel 2 cities over, booked for a Thursday night about 6 weeks earlier. That stood out because Daniel had told me that week he was staying overnight after a client dinner in a completely different area, one with a chain hotel near the airport he had used before. I opened the reservation. 1 adult. Check-in 6:10 p.m., checkout next morning. I felt that first drop in my stomach, the one that still leaves room for innocence. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe he had rebooked. Maybe there was some work explanation I didn't know. Then I saw another one. Different hotel, same city, different date. Again, a night he had supposedly been traveling for work. My hands started sweating. I clicked into that reservation too. 1 adult, private suite, late check-in, no corporate code attached, not work, not normal, not explainable by logistics. I could feel my body beginning to understand something my mind was still trying to slow down. I opened the loyalty profile linked to the account, thinking maybe I'd find a clue I could still rationalize. That is when I saw that the site had a feature I had never used before: linked companion stays. There, attached to both bookings, was a second profile used for check-in access and guest privileges. Not named openly in the reservation list, but easy enough to identify once you open the details. Nina, her full name. Her email truncated in a way I still recognized instantly. I think people imagine that discovering betrayal feels explosive. It didn't, not in the first 10 seconds. It felt like the room losing oxygen. I sat at my desk at work staring at that screen while the entire building around me kept functioning normally. Phones rang. Someone laughed down the hall. My computer fan hummed. And inside me, some central piece of reality started tearing away from the frame. I opened more reservations. There were 4 in total over 5 months. Different hotels. Same general region. Never too luxurious, never too cheap. The kind of places chosen by people who don't want a memorable trail but still want privacy. The dates lined up with Daniel's, work trips, and Nina's, mental health breaks, or weekends offline. Every little harmless explanation they had both fed me suddenly arranged itself into a pattern, so clean it felt insulting. I wish I could say I left work immediately and drove somewhere cinematic and cried in my car. I didn't. I took a screenshot, then another, then several more. Then I closed the browser because I felt like if I didn't act normal within the next 2 minutes, I might throw up on my keyboard. I made it through the rest of the day on what I can only describe as autopilot built from rage. Every email I answered felt like performance art. Every conversation with a coworker felt like language I had learned in a previous life. By the time I got home, I had made one decision. I was not confronting either of them until I knew exactly how far this went and exactly what I wanted to do with it. Daniel came home an hour later carrying Thai takeout from my favorite place because, he said, he knew I had a rough day. Nina texted me around the same time asking if I wanted to get coffee over the weekend because she missed me. There is a special level of psychological violence in being betrayed by 2 people who continue caring for you on the surface in real time. Not because the gestures are genuine, but because they make you feel like screaming inside a room no one else knows is burning. I sat at the kitchen counter, thanked my husband for dinner, replied to my best friend with a heart emoji, and understood with almost frightening clarity that whatever happened next needed to be patient. That night, I barely slept. I lay beside Daniel listening to him breathe and tried to place the man next to me inside the hotel rooms I had just seen. I imagined Nina there too, in those anonymous spaces designed for silence and checkout times and no emotional consequences. I tried to remember every time either of them had looked me in the face during the months those bookings covered. Every birthday, every girls' lunch, every dinner on our couch, every time Daniel kissed me goodbye for a work trip, every time Nina hugged me and asked how I was doing. The most disorienting thing about betrayal is not always the sex. It is the theater. It is realizing that while you were acting in good faith, someone else had been staging reactions around you for months. By morning, I had gone from shock to strategy. The first thing I needed to know was whether this was just an affair or whether it had become an entire narrative about me, because people who hide something together often build a private mythology to support it. I did not yet know if Nina had been confiding in me while sleeping with my husband, if Daniel had been laughing at my trust with her, or whether both of them had turned me into the easiest person in the room to manipulate. I suspected the answer was yes, but suspicion and proof are not the same thing, so I started small. I let the next week play out as normal while quietly collecting details. I checked dates against calendars. I looked back at old texts from both of them. I noticed how many times Nina had conveniently been out of town when Daniel was gone. I noticed how often she had discouraged me from questioning his distance. I noticed that the dates of the hotel stays often followed moments where I had expressed gratitude for her friendship or relief that Daniel had someone in my life he got along with so well. Reading those texts became its own kind of nausea. A week later, Nina came over for wine on a Thursday night because that had become our thing whenever Daniel worked late. She sat on my couch, tucked one leg under herself, and asked me if I ever worried that marriage slowly turns people into roommates. I stared at her, and maybe because I was finally seeing her clearly, her face looked different. Not physically, structurally. Her softness had seams now. I said I thought all relationships go through phases. She nodded slowly and said, I think people stay in things out of habit way longer than they should. I remember gripping my glass so tightly my fingers hurt because there she was, sitting in my house, drinking my wine, trying on the language of emotional truth while actively sleeping with my husband behind my back. That night after she left, I sat in the dark living room and realized I was no longer interested in whether their affair was emotional or physical or who started it. Those were smaller questions. The real question was how deeply they believed I was stupid. A few days after that, I got my answer. Daniel was in the shower when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter with a message from Nina that read, "Next month, same place or switch hotels." There are moments when the universe stops pretending subtlety is noble. I looked at the phone, then at the bathroom door, then back at the message. No code, no caution, not even enough fear to disguise the wording. I did not touch the phone because by then I already had enough. I just took a picture of the screen with my own phone and waited. When Daniel came out, towel over his shoulder, I mentioned casually that Nina had texted. He didn't even flinch. He picked up the phone, glanced at it, and said, "Oh, she's asking about a work event venue she might use." A venue. Same place or switch hotels. And he said it so smoothly that for one stunned second I understood something crucial. He had become this careless because he thought I was permanently manageable. That was the moment the ending started writing itself. I knew I didn't want a screaming kitchen confrontation. He was too composed, and she was too slippery. If I hit too early, they would coordinate the story before anyone else heard the truth. They deframe it as emotional confusion, a terrible mistake, an affair that happened recently because we were all under stress. No, what made this betrayal uniquely vicious was not just that they were sleeping together. It was that they had built a system around my trust. They used my marriage and my friendship as cover for each other. They moved inside my life with ease because I was the one providing the safety of the structure. If I was going to end this, I wanted them exposed inside the exact social space they had used to hide in. The opportunity arrived 3 weeks later when Daniel and I hosted a small summer dinner at our house. Nothing formal, but enough people to matter. A handful of close friends, Nina included, plus Daniel's brother and his wife, 2 mutual friends from college, and one couple from our neighborhood who had known us long enough to make the room feel real. Intimate enough for silence to hit hard. Public enough to ruin a lie. Perfect. For those 3 weeks, I played the role of my own wife perfectly. I was warm. I was normal. I did not pull away from Nina. I did not question Daniel. I let them believe they were still operating inside the same invisible architecture they had built. It is amazing what liars reveal when they think the stage is secure. Nina became bolder, though only in micro ways. She interrupted me more. She finished Daniel's sentences a little too naturally. She had that strange, inflated softness toward me that people get when they think they know something you don't. Daniel relaxed too. He started using the phrase like a sister again with almost bored confidence, especially around other people, as if invoking purity often enough could keep the room blessed against suspicion. The day of the dinner, I prepared everything carefully. Food half-made, candles ready, wine chilling, backyard lights set to turn on at sunset. And in the office drawer, hidden beneath a stack of notebooks, I had printed copies of the hotel bookings, the linked guest details, and screenshots of Nina's message about whether they should switch hotels. I did not need dozens of pages. I just needed enough to make denial impossible. There is an art to public exposure if you want it to land. Too much emotion and people fixate on your tone. Too little proof and they leave room for doubt. Too much proof and the moment becomes administrative instead of shocking. I wanted accuracy with force. Dinner started almost beautifully. That's what made it so satisfying later. Nina arrived with a lemon tart and kissed my cheek. Daniel opened wine and told everyone to ignore the mess in the kitchen. People laughed. Stories moved around the table. At one point, Nina and Daniel made eye contact over a joke and looked away so quickly that if I had not known, I might still have missed it. That's the thing about truth. Once it enters the room, it changes the lighting on everything. After dessert, while people were still relaxed and comfortable, Daniel suggested a toast because, in his words, he wanted to celebrate good people, good food, and the family we choose. I still think that was generous of him in a way. Nothing makes exposure more effective than a traitor speaking one sentence too confidently just before the floor drops out. He raised his glass, smiled around the table, and thanked everyone for being part of our life. Then he looked at Nina and said, "And to Nina, who has basically been my wife's sister for years and somehow puts up with both of us." A few people smiled. Someone laughed lightly. Nina tilted her head and said, "I do my best." That was when I stood up. I smiled too, because calm is radioactive in moments like that. I lifted my glass and said, "Actually, I want to add one more toast. To family, to trust, and to hotel loyalty programs that keep excellent records." The table went completely still. Nobody understood it yet except the 2 people who mattered, and that was visible instantly. Daniel's face lost color. Nina did not move at all. She just blinked once too slowly, which somehow looked guiltier than panic. I set my glass down, walked to the kitchen counter, and picked up the envelope I had left there. Then I came back to the table and placed the papers in front of them both. No one spoke. I said very calmly, "For months, my husband told me my best friend was like a sister. I believed him. Then I found your matching hotel bookings." If I live to be 100, I will never forget the silence that followed that sentence. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest in a way the whole year before had not been. Daniel opened his mouth, but I kept going. I said the dates out loud. The cities, the hotels, the message about whether they should switch places next time. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just laid out the truth the way you read inventory in a room full of people too shocked to interrupt. Then I looked at Nina and said, "You sat on this couch and told me not to overthink my marriage while you were sleeping with my husband in boutique hotels 2 cities over." Then I looked at Daniel and said, "And you looked me in the face and kept calling her family while booking rooms with her behind my back." His brother swore under his breath. One of my friends covered her mouth. Our neighbor stared at Daniel like she had never seen a man before. Nina tried to speak first, which told me everything I needed to know about her. She didn't start with sorry. She started with, "It's not what it looks like," the line pathetic people reach for when the evidence has already started reading itself. I laughed then. I truly laughed, and it startled even me. Not because anything was funny, but because there is something almost obscene about being offered confusion, after someone has finally shown you how much clarity they thought you could survive without. Daniel stood up and said we should talk privately. That was the second most insulting thing he said that night, privately, as if privacy had not been the very weapon they used against me. I looked at him and said, "No, you did your lying privately. You can hear the truth out loud." Then I handed the papers to his brother because once other hands touch evidence, the room changes. His brother looked at the bookings, then at Daniel and said, "Tell me this isn't real." Daniel didn't answer. Nina started crying. Real crying, too, which almost made me angrier. There is a type of woman who mistakes tears for moral complexity. I have no patience for that anymore. What came out over the next 10 minutes was exactly what I expected, and somehow still worse. At first, they both tried to frame it as recent, accidental, confusing, one of those terrible emotional mistakes that grew from vulnerability and stress. But liars lose rhythm when documents exist. Dates don't care about their story. I pointed out that the bookings went back months. I reminded Nina that she had comforted me through the exact period she was sleeping with him. I reminded Daniel that he had used her as proof of my safety repeatedly. That was when the room finally understood what made it so ugly. This wasn't just cheating. This was betrayal wrapped inside trust and delivered by two people who had spent months using their closeness to me as camouflage. Nina left first, not because she was brave enough to face what she'd done, but because one of my friends told her to get out of my house before she started pretending to be the victim. She was sobbing by then, mascara broken, hands shaking, saying she never meant for it to go this far. That line means nothing to me. Nothing ever goes this far by accident when it involves hotel bookings in multiple cities. You go that far on purpose, one reservation at a time. Daniel stayed, probably because he still believed he could manage the optics if he said the right thing after enough people left. He underestimated how completely his image had already collapsed. The men in the room were disgusted in that specific way men get when another man's behavior forces them to rethink what they've been calling decent. The women were quieter, colder. We all know what it means when another woman helps build the lie around you. It hits somewhere older than language. After everyone was gone, Daniel tried the full range of post-exposure behavior. Anger, tears, explanation, self-pity, blame. He said he had been unhappy for months. He said Nina understood him in ways I didn't. He said he had never meant to hurt me like this. He said he was going to end it. He said he didn't know how it got so out of control. I stood in the kitchen listening to my husband explain the logistics of destroying my life as if difficulty made it forgivable. Then I asked one question. "Did you ever laugh at me together?" He froze, just for a second. Then he said no too fast. That was enough. Because a man can apologize for cheating, but if he humiliated you with the other woman, something different dies. I told him to leave. Not tomorrow, not after sleep. Then. He did leave, though not gracefully. He packed one bag, kept saying we should not make permanent decisions in the middle of a crisis, and paused at the door like he wanted me to stop him. I didn't. When the door shut, I sat on the kitchen floor and finally cried. Not because I wanted him back, not because I still needed answers, but because there is a specific grief in realizing that two people you trusted did not just betray you physically. They studied your trust and used it as infrastructure. The days that followed were ugly, administrative, and clarifying. Nina sent long messages at first, then voice notes, then one handwritten letter dropped off through my mailbox as if stationery could add dignity to what she had done. I didn't answer any of them. Daniel alternated between remorse and narrative control. He wanted us to tell people it had become an emotional affair because our marriage had been struggling. That was his preferred version, cleaner and more flattering to him. But I didn't let him keep that story. Every time someone important asked what happened, I told the truth in one sentence. My husband was sleeping with my best friend, and they used my trust in both of them to hide it. I learned very quickly that clarity is more powerful than detail when the truth is already ugly enough. There was one final layer I uncovered during the separation process that made everything even more revolting. Daniel had used our shared card points to cover 2 of the hotel stays, which meant that while I was thanking him for being so on top of our finances, I was partially paying for the rooms where he and my best friend were sleeping together. That discovery did not change the marriage, which was already over, but it did sharpen my sense of what kind of people they had chosen to be. Not just reckless, entitled, not just selfish, comfortable. They were so comfortable inside my trust that it didn't even occur to them to hide certain details properly. That may have been the most satisfying part in the long run. It wasn't genius that took them down. It was arrogance. People always ask later whether I miss Nina more or Daniel more. The answer is neither and both, but not in the way they think. I don't miss the people they turned out to be. I miss the reality I thought I lived in when they were still inside it honestly. I miss what I believed friendship meant. I miss what I believed marriage protected. I miss not knowing how easily two people can coordinate their softness while planning your humiliation behind your back. But once you see it, truly see it, you can never go back to wanting the counterfeit versions. The reward at the end was not dramatic in the movie sense. There was no courtroom confession, no screaming confrontation months later in public, no grand revenge stunt involving microphones or projectors. I didn't need that. The real reward was more precise. They lost the exact version of the story they had counted on keeping. Nina lost the image of loyal friend that had given her access to my life and my private thoughts. Daniel lost the image of thoughtful husband who respected my friendships and loved me in a mature, grounded way. They both lost the social protection of ambiguity because I refused to grant it to them. And maybe most satisfying of all, they lost each other too. Yes, that part happened. Affairs built on contempt do not age well under real daylight. Once the secrecy ended and the shame settled in, they didn't get some grand romantic payoff. They got exposure, blame, mistrust, and the ugly practical consequences of discovering that people capable of betraying one trusted person together are rarely capable of building something clean with each other afterward. I heard through mutual friends months later that Nina told someone she had thought Daniel would leave me sooner and make the whole thing easier. That sentence gave me more peace than she will ever understand, because it meant that even inside their fantasy, she had been waiting too. Waiting for honesty that never came. Waiting for a version of him that did not exist. She betrayed me for a man who was never brave enough to choose her openly and never decent enough to choose me honestly. There is punishment in that all by itself. As for Daniel, his ending was smaller and therefore better. He kept trying to shape the breakup into something mutual, complicated, sad, adult. He wanted people to believe our marriage had simply run its course and that feelings had developed elsewhere in unfortunate timing. He hated that I would not let him have that. He hated that every version of the truth I told made him sound exactly like what he was. A man who slept with his wife's best friend while using that same friend as proof of safety. The cleaner he tried to sound, the dirtier the facts made him look. That is the beauty of accurate language. It leaves liars nowhere soft to land. The hardest part of healing was not anger. Anger was easy. The hardest part was relearning that not every intimate relationship is secretly collaborative against you. For a while, I distrusted warmth itself. If two people got along too well around me, I noticed. If someone said, "You can trust me," some private alarm went off. It took time to understand that my instincts had not failed me. They had been trained into silence. There's a difference. Women blame themselves too quickly when manipulation works, but manipulation works precisely because it is built to feel unreasonable to resist. I was not stupid. I was loyal in the presence of two disloyal people. If you're hearing this and wondering whether something in your own life feels wrong in a way you keep talking yourself out of, listen carefully. Betrayal rarely introduces itself as proof. It usually arrives first as repetition, a phrase used too often, a timing that keeps brushing against coincidence, a person who always has a soft explanation ready before you've even fully named the discomfort. Pay attention to what keeps needing to be verbally certified as innocent. Pay attention to which relationships make you feel ashamed for noticing patterns. Shame is one of the liar's favorite housekeepers. It cleans up suspicion before it can become action. I lost a husband and a best friend in the same collapse, which sounds devastating when people say it back to me. And it was. But I also lost something else that needed to die. The version of myself who thought loyalty was proven by how much confusion you can endure without asking harder questions. I don't admire that woman anymore. I feel tenderness toward her, yes, because she loved honestly in a room full of dishonesty. But I don't aspire to be her again. What saved me in the end wasn't softness. It was clarity. Cold, humiliating, unforgettable clarity. That That's why the hotel bookings mattered so much. Not because paper is more painful than a confession, but because the bookings reduced their entire secret world to logistics. Dates, rooms, times, linked names, no poetry, no complicated emotional mythology. Just proof that while I was home trusting them, they were coordinating check-in times. There is something deeply healing about betrayal becoming ordinary enough to document. It strips it of the romance traders used to flatter themselves. They weren't star-crossed. They were booking rooms. If you want more stories like this, subscribe now. There's a lot more coming. And before you go, I've got another story here you should watch next. It starts with trust, turns darker than expected, and ends in a way you won't see coming. Click into that next one because you do not want to miss it.